The U.S. government has harmed or killed people to keep a secret UFO crash recovery program a secret. This is the stunning allegation revealed in the most recent congressional hearing on UFOs, this time with 3 witnesses, one of which claims to have direct knowledge of said crash retrieval program. Here's our breakdown of what exactly went on at this historic meeting. Just in time for the summer blockbusters of Barbie and Oppenheimer, Congress dropped a blockbuster of its own, the first UFO whistleblower congressional briefing to ever take place in the public eye. And here it's important to note that this is the first public hearing because, as the congressmen and women themselves confirm, there have been prior briefings held in secret. The stars of the show were 3 whistleblowers, David Fravor, Ryan Graves, and David Grush. The world had heard from Fravor and Graves before, who were both involved in high-profile UFO/UAP incidents, but Grush is a relative newcomer who dropped his own bombshell in June of 2023. Ryan Graves is a former Navy pilot who between the summer of 2014 and March of 2015 was aboard the aircraft carrier Theodore Roosevelt. During this time period, as the carrier's F-18 Super Hornets operated in training exercises from off the coast of Virginia to Florida, they encountered UFOs on a nearly daily basis. According to Graves, sightings became so frequent that soon pilots were no longer surprised, until one nearly collided with an F-18, prompting the Navy to write up an incident report. Graves' unit would go on to record one of the objects zooming over the waves with their forward-looking infrared camera. David Fravor had his own UFO encounter all the way back in 2004 while he was serving aboard the USS Nimitz as commander of a Super Hornet squadron. While on a training flight with his wingwoman, Fravor was notified of the USS Princeton detecting unidentified contacts. The Princeton had just received a new advanced radar, and there was concern that there might be some issues to work out. The objects appeared to be descending from 80,000 feet to sea level in less than a second, prompting the Princeton to request Fravor's flight to check the situation out. Upon arriving at the coordinates, the Super Hornets discovered what would become infamously known as the Tic Tac. Observed by pilots and their weapon system officers, the Tic Tac-like object was the size of a large aircraft, but shaped like the Candy, and with no visible flight surfaces. When Fravor dipped his Super Hornet down to take a closer look, the Tic Tac mirrored his movements to maintain separation. When Fravor maneuvered aggressively to cut off the Tic Tac, the object accelerated to hypersonic speeds, appearing 60 miles away on radar less than a minute later. The last of the 3 witnesses, David Grush, has admitted that he's never seen a UFO himself. However, he has seen other things that disturbed him enough to turn whistleblower. Grush was an intelligence officer with the National Geospatial Agency and liaison to the Pentagon's official UAP investigation. In this capacity, he was exposed to multiple personnel whom Grush claims were either a part of or had knowledge of a secret U.S. government program to recover crashed UFOs. Alarmed at the multiple crimes he said he learned of, as well as a complete lack of congressional oversight, Grush briefed the Senate Intelligence Committee, otherwise known as the Gang of Eight, before eventually going public with his claims. Since then, he's been very cagey about what exactly he talks about in a public setting, but he has volunteered multiple times to brief congressmen and women in the appropriate security setting, and as long as they themselves have the proper security clearances. With witnesses set, what exactly went down at this briefing? Grush was questioned about Representative Tim Burchett about his whistleblowing, with Grush confirming that he'd suffered reprisal from within the intelligence community for bringing this information to light. This tracks with what we can verify from Grush. Grush originally broke his story via News Nation, stating that the New York Times was interested but would take too long to publish his story. Grush has never answered why he felt it was important to get his story out fast, with a lesser-known news network, rather than the prestigious New York Times, who broke the original Pentagon UFO investigation, as well as the Navy UFO videos back in 2017. It seems, though, that fear of imminent reprisal might have motivated Grush to get his story out to the public as soon as possible. Grush claimed that when he briefed the U.S. Senate about the UFO recovery program, he was immediately harassed and intimidated by members of the intelligence community, claiming that there had even been a break-in to his home. He filed an official complaint with the Inspector General of the intelligence community, who, after a 2-week investigation, wrote a letter stating that it was their opinion that claims about harassment toward Grush from within the U.S. intelligence community were valid and should be investigated immediately. This is a letter we can verify, as it's part of the public record, So despite refusing to speak on specific details outside of a classified setting, we can verify that someone inside of the US government attempted to harass and intimidate Grush for speaking to Congress about a UFO recovery program. Grush would go on to remain cagey with answers regarding his harassment, as the investigation by the Inspector General is still active. He did state, though, that the harassment he endured was, quote, brutal. Tim Burkett then asked Grush if he had knowledge of people being harmed or killed in order to keep this recovery program a secret. Grush confirmed that it had in fact happened, stating that someone close to him had experienced some form of harassment, although he didn't go into detail with this claim either. Once more, he stated that he would brief Congress in the proper setting, but confirmed that he had given specific information to the Gang of Eight in his closed-door hearing. From here, the convention turned to UAPs and their very nature. Are these objects a threat to the United States? All witnesses confirmed that while they didn't have the knowledge that these objects were actively threatening, their very capabilities made them a significant threat to the United States, potentially the planet, should they turn hostile. In the words of David Fravor, their technology far outstrips anything in the inventory of the United States. When Fravor and Graves were asked if they felt they could have defended themselves with their F-18 Super Hornets, both witnesses agreed that they felt like they would have had no chance. It's interesting to note here that Representative Tim Burkett had previously conducted an interview with John Michael Gauthier on his Event Horizon podcast, where he stated that what he had seen in the classified setting made him feel like these objects could potentially be a threat to the entire world. On the capabilities of these craft, Graves stated that he and his squadron would spot these objects hanging in the sky at zero airspeed, meaning that they were actively resisting the force of up to a Category 4 winds to remain perfectly still relative to the surface of the ocean. However, in the blink of an eye, the objects had the ability to reach up to Mach 1.2 or more and move in very erratic patterns throughout the sky that would significantly damage a living pilot, if not kill them outright. Both Fravor and Graves were of the opinion that current human materials science simply couldn't take the stresses of the maneuvers they observed. Fravor would go on to state that what disturbed him the most about the craft he observed was its flight performance. Nothing in the US inventory could match it, and it was clear that if this object ever had a hostile intent, it could have easily destroyed the Super Hornets and killed their crews with impunity. Here we note that in Grush's whistleblower report, he states that he was aware of incidents where military personnel were harmed or possibly killed by hostile acts of UAPs. As usual, he declined to give details that were classified, but the implication is still clear. The US military may have lost lives to the actions of non-human craft. He did also state before this briefing that as part of the UFO recovery program, he was aware of the fact that some personnel involved in the study of these craft had either been killed or harmed. Kinda makes you wonder if the US government has a supply of Class D personnel. After the briefing, investigative journalist George Knapp submitted a letter to the Congressional investigation written to him by a Russian colonel. In the letter, the colonel claims that the Russian aerospace forces had also been involved in hostile events with UFOs after some of their aircraft attempted to shoot them down on numerous occasions. On at least 2 occasions, the UFOs disabled the Russian aircraft somehow, leading to the planes crashing and the death of their pilots. After that, the Russian Ministry of Defense issued a blanket order that pilots were from now on to leave UFOs completely alone, warning that their ability for reprisal could be, quote, catastrophic. As part of the ongoing investigation, multiple senators asked David Grush if he could provide more specific details of where the investigation should look next. Grush confirmed that he could share the names of specific personnel, physical locations, and names of projects to look at, even stating that he could provide a list of both cooperative and hostile witnesses. However, as usual, he could not do so in a public setting. This is a major deal because verifying Grush's story is now only a matter of Congress investigating the locations, personnel, and projects that he claims are involved in the recovery program or have knowledge of it. But this might be trickier than expected because Grush also warned that he was aware of the fact that a number of these recovered craft and materials had been given by the US government to private aerospace companies in order to avoid congressional oversight and freedom of information requests. This took place as far back as the 1950s, and Grush stated that he knew exactly which companies had some of the materials and he'd be willing to share that information. Confirming the claims of conspiracy theorists for the last 7 decades, Grush also confirmed that he was aware of a disinformation campaign undertaken by parts of the government to discredit UFO witnesses and discourage their investigation. He would not speak to the details of this in public, but one need only look at the rich, thriving culture of ridicule surrounding UFOs to see just how effective such a campaign has truly been. We are, after all, living in a world where 4 trained Navy aviators all witnessed a tic-tac object defying the laws of physics, and some random YouTube big brain claims they had simply all misidentified a passenger jet in the distance. And people accepted this answer. Honestly, if we've got combat aviators who can't tell the difference between a craft that violates physics and a 747 on the horizon, then America has Russia levels of problems with the competency of its military. Need more proof of ridicule culture? Here's prominent science educator and general science celebrity Neil deGrasse Tyson ridiculing the Navy's Tic Tac video by claiming UFOs are always out of focus, thus insinuating it's nothing more than a prosaic object that's been misidentified. And of course, we're all silly to think otherwise. Meanwhile, Mr. Tyson apparently doesn't realize that the markings on the video, like the elevation deviation lines, are also fuzzy, meaning the entire video is low resolution and likely provided that way by the US Navy because it always de-reses footage from its combat sensors. Further, he fails to account for the 4 trained aviators who spotted the object, because it's easier to make fun of footage than it is to slander 4 highly qualified witnesses. This isn't skepticism, it's denialism. The culture of ridicule has seriously impeded research on the topic, even by the Department of Defense itself, which has admitted that pilots are not reporting UFO sightings for fear of reprisal or ridicule. And this matters a lot, because not every UFO exhibits exotic flight characteristics. Some are just strange and weird, and sometimes these strange and weird craft end up being brand new Russian or Chinese platforms. Thanks to a culture of ridicule, the US has been blindsided by the development of multiple foreign aircraft, many of which have been used as reconnaissance assets very close to US operations. The US Navy and Air Force have moved to establish new UAP reporting guidelines to try to cut through this culture of ridicule, which is becoming a very serious threat to national security. When Graves was asked about the Roosevelt's encounters and how many pilots he believes actually reported their sightings, he said that he believed only 5% of all encounters were ever reported, and often those reports went nowhere. The briefing moved on to who knew what and what they knew. Grush was asked if there were government personnel who knew more about the UFO phenomenon and a possible recovery program than their peers did, and Grush confirmed that there were in fact some elected officials who were privy to much more information than others. This directly led to the question of if the US government had made any formal contact with non-human intelligences. Grush refused to answer this in the positive or the negative, stating that he'd only do so inside of a properly classified briefing. However, Grush did confirm his earlier claims that we are in fact dealing with a non-human intelligence. As part of the crash retrieval program, biological remains were discovered that were non-human in origin. This was the assessment of the people Grush spoke to, who were working or had knowledge of the program. Again, Grush reiterated that he had never seen these objects or the occupants for himself, but that he could provide a list of witnesses, both hostile and cooperative, who had. At this point, Representative Matt Gaetz disclosed his own experience attempting to gain cooperation from the military on a UAP matter. At some point earlier this year, his office received a protected disclosure notification, or a whistleblower report, of an incident that had occurred to personnel at Eglin Air Force Base. Gaetz would go on to confirm that a U.S. surveillance aircraft out on a training flight had encountered a formation of UAPs flying in a diamond formation. Approaching them to take a closer look, his radar and FLIR equipment both malfunctioned and the pilot was forced to take a photograph of one of the objects manually. However, when Gaetz arrived at Eglin Air Force Base, he was not allowed to meet with the flight crew, was denied the radar tapes showing the 4 contacts in flight, and was denied access to the photographs taken by the pilot. Gaetz had to use his congressional authority to force military personnel to allow him to speak with part of the crew. And while he was still denied the radar tapes, he was allowed to see one of the photographs taken by the pilot, prompting Gaetz to state that what he was looking at was, quote, something I am not able to attach to any human capabilities. Later, Gaetz was told by military test pilots that there was an unspoken code of conduct in the community. You don't report UAPs, and if you see one, then, quote, the best thing to do is to forget about it. After the hearing, Representative Burkett would confirm that he had talked to pilots who stated they often destroyed evidence of UAPs from their aircraft systems just to avoid even bringing the issue up. After the briefing was concluded, to the shock of nobody, the intelligence community denied the congressional investigation the use of an SCIF, or Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility. An SCIF is where the U.S. military and government speaks about the most sensitive of matters. The most highly classified information can only be discussed in one of these specially constructed facilities. Their size can vary from a phone booth-sized room to the entire floor of a building. Their walls are made of material that prevents any form of electromagnetic eavesdropping, and the walls and door are built with reinforced metal mesh or metal studs to prevent forced break-ins. Soundproofing material and acoustic sealant makes it impossible to hear anything from the outside, and the doors feature deadbolts, combination locks, and access control systems. To prevent acoustic weak points, wiring runs along the wall rather than flush with it, and vents allowing air in can only be of a maximum size and protected by metal bars. All cell phones and other unsecured electronic devices are strictly banned, and they have motion sensors to detect movement when not in use. Indications are the congressional investigation is prepared and willing to enact the Holman Rule if they continue to be denied access to an SCIF to hear Grush's testimony completely unredacted. The Holman Rule is a congressional tool meant to help ensure power over the federal government. It allows Congress to reduce the salary of specific federal employees, fire them outright, and even gut entire federal programs. But the real question is why the intelligence community is denying the use of the SCIF in the first place. If Grush's testimony is just more conspiracy theory nonsense, as many believe, then why is the intelligence community interested in A. harassing him directly, and B. denying Congress the means by which to hear his testimony? Even more worryingly, why is the intelligence community blocking legislation that would mandate that UAP reports by commercial airline pilots be made immediately available to Congress? And where does the intelligence community get the authority to block legislation by the people it's supposed to be working for? Now go check out Soviet Union declassified UFO encounters revealed, or click this other link instead.